The Dachau incident, a controversial moment after liberation. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. On April 29, 1945, American troops reached the gates of Dachau, one of the most infamous sites created by the Nazi regime. The war in Europe was nearly over. Germany was collapsing. What the soldiers expected to find was resistance, perhaps surrender. What they encountered instead was something that defied every frame of reference they had brought with them. Behind the barbed wire were thousands of human beings reduced to survival alone. Nearby, evidence of what had taken place was impossible to ignore. In that moment, the line between battlefield discipline and raw human reaction began to blur. What followed that day would become one of the most uncomfortable and contested episodes of the war's final weeks. An event that raised questions not only about Nazi crimes, but about how justice, anger, and authority collide when control suddenly changes hands. This is the story of Dachau's liberation and the controversy that still surrounds what happened next. Even before reaching the camp itself, something felt wrong. Soldiers later recalled a powerful odor that did not resemble anything they had encountered on the battlefield. Following the source, they came upon a line of railway cars standing on a siding. When the doors were opened, the contents inside stunned even seasoned combat veterans. Thousands of bodies were packed tightly into the wagons, evidence of prolonged neglect and deliberate cruelty. For many soldiers, this was the moment when the abstract idea of Nazi crimes became undeniable and immediate. Shortly afterward, American troops entered the Dachau concentration camp. Inside, they found survivors in an advanced state of physical collapse. Many were barely able to stand. Some did not react at all, uncertain whether the arrival of uniformed soldiers meant rescue or another deception. Years of captivity had taught them not to trust sudden change. The shock experienced by the soldiers was profound. Dachau was not simply a prison, it was a system built to erase human dignity. The sight of emaciated survivors, combined with the evidence outside the gates, pushed many beyond emotional control. Training and discipline collided with disbelief and anger. The SS command structure at the camp had already disintegrated. Senior officers had fled upon learning that American forces were approaching. Those guards who remained surrendered quickly as the camp was secured. At that point, authority shifted abruptly. The captors were now prisoners, and the prisoners were suddenly free. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the most contested episodes of the war's final days. Some accounts describe confusion as American soldiers attempted to secure the camp, disarm guards, and establish order. Prisoners moved freely for the first time in years. Medical aid was urgently needed, but resources were limited. Commanders struggled to impose structure on a scene that defied normal military procedure. Other accounts describe acts of retaliation. Groups of surrendered SS guards were gathered and confined in temporary holding areas. At some point, gunfire broke out. When officers returned, several guards were found dead. The circumstances surrounding these deaths have never been fully agreed upon. Estimates of how many guards were killed vary widely. Some witnesses later claimed dozens died. Others suggested higher numbers. Eyewitness testimony conflicted sharply, influenced by perspective, timing, and emotional state. Some soldiers asserted that guards attempted to escape and were shot while fleeing. Others insisted no such attempt occurred. Adding to the complexity were reports that former prisoners themselves took part in violent reprisals. After years of starvation, punishment, and humiliation, some individuals acted against guards when the opportunity arose. These acts were not organized or directed by American command. They occurred in the chaotic space created when total control suddenly vanished. In the aftermath of the war, these events did not go unnoticed. The U.S. Army launched an internal investigation into what had occurred at Dachau. For decades, the findings of this inquiry remained classified, contributing to speculation and debate. When the investigation was eventually made public, it acknowledged that international rules governing the treatment of surrendered personnel may have been violated. At the same time, it emphasized the extraordinary psychological conditions faced by the soldiers who entered the camp. The conclusion was controversial. While recognizing that deaths had occurred after surrender, the investigation recommended no prosecutions. The reasoning was that assigning individual responsibility under such circumstances would be impractical and potentially unjust. Emotional shock, extreme provocation, and the absence of clear command intent were cited as mitigating factors. This decision has remained a point of contention. Critics argue that the failure to pursue accountability undermined the moral foundation of post-war justice. They contend that rules exist precisely to restrain retaliation, even under the most extreme circumstances. Supporters counter that applying abstract legal standards to soldiers who had just discovered mass atrocity ignored the human reality of the moment. What makes the Dachau incident especially difficult to assess is that it resists simple moral framing. The SS guards present at the camp were part of a system responsible for immense suffering. Many prisoners would not have survived much longer. Yet the principles governing surrender and restraint exist to prevent cycles of violence from continuing indefinitely. Dachau demonstrates how quickly moral certainty can fracture when control shifts suddenly. Liberation did not arrive as a clean transition from injustice to order. It arrived through chaos, emotion, and imperfect human responses. For survivors, the day marked a rebirth. Many later described the moment they were addressed by name again, rather than by number. For American soldiers, it marked a transformation in how they understood the war. It was no longer about territory or victory alone, but about confronting the consequences of unchecked power. In the years that followed, Dachau became a site of formal justice. Trials were held against former camp personnel. Hundreds of individuals were prosecuted for crimes committed within its walls. In that sense, accountability did follow, but it came later, through structured legal processes rather than immediate response. The events of April 29, 1945 remain an uncomfortable reminder that even in wars defined by clear moral opposition, moments arise that do not fit neatly into categories of right and wrong. They occupy a space where law, emotion, and human limitation collide. Dachau's liberation forces historians and audiences alike to confront an unsettling truth. The collapse of absolute evil does not automatically produce perfect justice. Instead, it exposes the fragility of restraint and the difficulty of maintaining moral clarity when confronted with the unbearable. That is why the Dachau massacre remains debated. Not because the crimes of the camp are in question, but because the response to those crimes reveals how deeply war can test the values it claims to defend. The liberation of Dachau revealed the full scale of Nazi crimes to the world. But it also revealed something else: how fragile moral clarity can become in the face of overwhelming injustice. The controversy surrounding that day is not about equating crimes. It is about understanding how extreme circumstances test the very principles meant to guide humanity through conflict. Justice after atrocity is never simple. It unfolds unevenly, shaped by emotion, memory, and power. Dachau reminds us that history is not only a record of what should have happened, but of what actually did: messy, unresolved, and deeply human. The final question remains open, not because it lacks answers, but because it demands reflection. When absolute evil collapses, how do we ensure that the response does not lose the very values it seeks to defend?